The transport ship's hull groaned against the gravitational pull of Kethvar as it descended through the perpetual storm clouds that shrouded the prison moon. Princess Lyrelai pressed her slender fingers against the small viewport, watching lightning fork across the orange sky like the claws of some cosmic predator. Her reflection stared back at her, large amber eyes set in a delicate face framed by silver fur, pointed ears that drooped with exhaustion and defeat. Everything about her screamed fragility in a species that prized strength above all else. "Last stop, Your Highness," the guard's voice dripped with mockery as he unlocked her restraints. The metal cuffs had left raw marks on her wrists, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. "Try not to die too quickly. The betting pools back home are giving you 3 days. Lyrelai said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her siblings had made their position clear during the trial. Prince Kareth, heir to the throne, had stood before the Hegemony Council with his massive frame radiating psychic dominance, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he pronounced her sentence. The royal bloodline must remain pure. Weakness cannot be tolerated, especially not in one who shares our sacred heritage. Princess Vexara, the war leader whose tactical brilliance had crushed 3 stellar nations, had been more direct. She brings shame to our name. Exile is mercy. I would have chosen the execution chamber. Their words echoed in Lyrelai's mind as the transport touched down on the rocky surface of Kethvar with a bone-jarring impact. The cargo bay doors hissed open, releasing a blast of acrid air that burned her sensitive nostrils. The gravity here was heavier than home, making her already fragile bones ache with each step. Perfect for a prison world where escape was meant to be impossible. Move. The guard shoved her toward the exit with unnecessary force. Lyrelai stumbled but caught herself, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall. She had been stripped of her royal garments and dressed in the rough brown fabric of a common prisoner. No jewels adorned her neck, no ceremonial weapons hung at her side. She was nobody now. The surface of Kethvar stretched before her like a vision of damnation. Jagged rocks jutted from the barren ground like broken bones, and the air shimmered with heat despite the constant storm cover. In the distance, she could see the sprawling complex of the prison facility, a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by covered walkways, all designed with the brutal efficiency that the Vulpine hegemony applied to everything it touched. But it was the prisoners themselves that made Lyrelai's breath catch in her throat. Scattered across the workyards, laboring under the watchful eyes of armed guards, were beings from dozens of different species. Most she recognized: the crystalline Jektai with their naturally armored hides, the massive Gorvani whose thick skulls could shatter steel, the serpentine Sithkar whose venomous bites could fell a war beast. All of them were here because they had opposed the hegemony in some way, and all of them were strong enough to survive this place. Then she saw them. A group of pale bipedal creatures working near the main gate, their movements coordinated despite their apparent frailty. They were smaller than most species here, with soft skin that looked like it would tear at the slightest touch, and strange fur that only grew on top of their heads. Their limbs were thin, their build slight, and yet something about them made the hardened criminals around them give them a wide berth. Humans. The guard followed her gaze and spat into the dust. Newest addition to our collection. Found them trying to establish some kind of colony in hegemony space 3 cycles ago. Thought they could hide behind their diplomatic immunity and primitive technology. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. Command decided to make an example of them. Rounded up their entire settlement and shipped them here. Lyrelai watched as one of the humans, a female with hair the color of autumn leaves, helped another who had stumbled under the weight of the metal beam he was carrying. The gesture was small, almost meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it made something twist in Lyrelai's chest. When was the last time anyone had shown her such casual kindness? "They won't last long," the guard continued conversationally. "No natural weapons, no armor, no psychic abilities. Half of them were dead within the first month. The rest are just too stupid to lie down and die properly." A transport barge loaded with ore rumbled past them, stirring up clouds of choking dust. Through the haze, Lyrelai saw one of the Gorvani prisoners shove a human out of his way, sending the smaller being sprawling. The human male, with dark skin and graying hair at his temples, picked himself up without complaint and continued working. No retaliation, no show of dominance, just patient endurance. It reminded her of herself, and that thought was more disturbing than anything else about this place. The guard delivered her to the processing center, where a bored-looking Vulpine administrator barely glanced up from his datapad as he assigned her a cell number and work detail. Sector 7, mining operations. Try to keep up. The implication was clear. If she couldn't match the productivity standards, there would be consequences. Her cell was a concrete box barely large enough to lie down in, with a narrow window that offered a view of the electrical fence and guard towers that surrounded the complex. The bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame, the toilet was a hole in the floor, and the single light fixture flickered with the inconsistency of failing power systems. It was designed to break spirits, and Lirelei could feel it working. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried not to think about the palace she had called home for the first 23 years of her life, the gardens where she had spent hours reading ancient texts while her siblings trained in combat, the library where she had discovered her love for xenoarchaeology and stellar history, the workshops where she had tinkered with small inventions that her tutors had dismissed as worthless curiosities. All of it was gone now. All of it might as well have never existed. Flame came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the night shift and the distant rumble of mining equipment. When the morning alarm shrieked through the facility, Lirelei felt like she hadn't rested at all. The gravity still made her bones ache, and her muscles protested as she forced herself to stand and prepare for her first day as a common laborer. The mining sector was a maze of tunnels carved directly into the moon's rocky core. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of industrial solvents, and the constant vibration of heavy machinery made her sensitive ears ring. She was assigned to a crew responsible for hauling ore carts from the deep tunnels to the processing stations, backbreaking work even for species with natural physical advantages. Her team consisted of a Jektai enforcer who regarded her with undisguised contempt, 2 Sithkar who hissed their conversations in their native tongue, and 3 humans who kept to themselves near the back of the group. The crew chief, a scarred Gorvani named Tak, sized her up with one glance and shook his massive head in disgust. "Great, they give me a princess who looks like she'll break if I breathe on her too hard." His voice was like grinding stone, and his psychic presence radiated the kind of casual violence that came from a lifetime of conflict. "Listen, Your Highness, I don't care what title you used to have. Down here, you pull your weight or you get dropped down a deep shaft. Understood?" Lirelei nodded, not trusting her voice. She had spent her whole life being dismissed for her physical weakness, but it felt different here. At home, her inability to match her siblings had been shameful. Here it might be fatal. The first cart nearly broke her. The ore was some kind of heavy mineral that the hegemony used in their warship armor, and even with the mechanized assistance of the transport system, moving at required strengths she simply didn't possess. Her arms shook with the effort, and sweat soaked through her work clothes despite the cool air of the tunnels. By midday, her hands were bloody and her legs were cramping. It was then that she noticed one of the humans watching her. He was older than the others in their group, with silver threading through his brown hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of experience and hardship. Unlike the other species in the prison, he didn't radiate any kind of psychic presence at all. To her enhanced senses, it was like looking at a blank space in the shape of a person. But there was something in his expression, a calculating intelligence that made her wonder what he was thinking. During the midday break, when the other prisoners clustered into their species groups to share water and rations, the human approached her. Up close, she could see that his work clothes were as ragged as hers, but he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had adapted to their circumstances rather than simply enduring them. "You're the Vulpine princess," he said, and his accent was unlike anything she had heard before, softer than the harsh consonants of hegemony standard, with vowel sounds that seemed to flow into each other. "I'm Marcus Chen, formerly of the Tau Ceti Agricultural Collective, currently a guest of your people's hospitality." The way he said it, without bitterness or fear, caught her off guard. "I'm not a princess anymore," she replied, surprised by how raw her own voice sounded. "I'm just another prisoner." Marcus smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face completely. "That's where you're wrong. A title is just a word. What you are, that's something they can't take away with exile or imprisonment." He gestured toward the ore cart that had been defeating her all morning. "Though I admit that particular skill set might not be immediately applicable to mineral extraction." Despite everything, Lirelei found herself almost smiling in return. "Is there a point to this conversation, or are you just naturally inclined toward philosophical discussions in industrial settings?" "Practical discussions, actually." Marcus pulled a small piece of metal from his pocket, a bracket that had been bent into a specific shape. "You see, I've been watching how you work. You're trying to use brute force, because that's what everyone expects. But you're built for precision, not power. Sometimes the solution isn't to hit harder. Sometimes it's to hit smarter." He attached the bracket to the cart's frame in a way that created a simple but effective lever system. When Lyrelay tried moving the cart again, the difference was immediate. The load didn't get lighter, but the mechanical advantage made it manageable for someone with her limited physical strength. "How did you—" she started. "Engineering background," Marcus replied casually. Turns out that designing efficient farming equipment and improving prison labor systems require a lot of the same principles. Leverage, distribution of force, working with your limitations instead of against them. For the first time since her exile, Lyrelay felt something other than despair. It was a small thing, almost meaningless in the grand scope of her situation, but it represented something important. She wasn't as helpless as everyone, including herself, had assumed. The rest of the day passed more easily. With the modified cart, she was able to keep pace with the team, and Talk's constant threats shifted from promises of violence to merely general disapproval. The other prisoners began to ignore her rather than actively despising her presence, which felt like a substantial improvement. That evening, as they were escorted back to their cells, Marcus fell into step beside her. "There's something you should know," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that the guards couldn't overhear. "The humans here, we've been organizing. Nothing dramatic. Just small improvements to working conditions, sharing resources, that sort of thing. But some of the other species have started to take notice." "What kind of notice?" Lyrelay asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The kind that gets people reassigned to solitary confinement or worse." Marcus glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. The guards don't like it when prisoners start cooperating across species lines. Makes them nervous. And when hegemony personnel get nervous, people tend to disappear. They had reached the junction where the cell blocks branched off in different directions. Marcus stopped and looked at her directly, his human eyes meeting her Vulpine ones with an intensity that was somehow both gentle and uncompromising. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "But if you're interested in more than just surviving this place, if you want to actually live here, then find me tomorrow. I think you might be surprised by what humans can accomplish when we put our minds to it." As Lyrelay lay in her narrow bed that night, staring up at the flickering light fixture and listening to the sounds of the prison settling around her, she thought about Marcus's words. Her siblings had exiled her because they saw her as weak, incapable of contributing to the strength of the hegemony. Her own people had written her off as a genetic defect, a mistake to be quietly disposed of. But maybe they were wrong. Maybe strength wasn't just about physical power or psychic dominance. Maybe it was about finding solutions where others saw only problems, about seeing possibilities where others saw only limitations. For the first time since her trial, Princess Lyrelay allowed herself to hope, and in the darkness of her cell, surrounded by the concrete and steel of her prison, she began to plan. 3 weeks into her imprisonment, Lyrelay discovered that humans were far more dangerous than anyone in the hegemony had imagined. It started with small things, the way they had quietly reorganized the work schedules to give each species optimal rest periods based on their biological needs, how they had modified the water distribution system to provide cleaner drinking supplies without alerting the guards to the changes, the subtle but effective first aid network they had established using improvised medical supplies and knowledge pooled from their diverse backgrounds. Marcus had introduced her to the unofficial Human Leadership Council during the 4th week, a clandestine meeting held in one of the unused storage chambers deep in the mining complex. The gathering included Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, a former terraforming engineer with red hair and a quick smile that never quite reached her eyes. There was Dr. James Okafor, whose medical training had proved invaluable in keeping prisoners alive when the official healthcare system failed them. Elena Vasquez brought tactical experience from her service in planetary security forces, while David Kim contributed his background in communications and information systems. What struck Lyrelay immediately was how they worked together. Vulpine leadership was based on dominance hierarchies. The strongest voice commanded, the weaker voices obeyed. But the humans seemed to operate on some form of consensus building that she didn't fully understand. Marcus might have been the de facto leader, but every decision was discussed, debated, and refined through input from the entire group. The key, Marcus explained during one of these sessions, is that we don't try to fight the system directly. We work within it, around it, through it. We make ourselves indispensable while appearing completely harmless. Like parasites, Sarah added with a grin that was sharp enough to cut steel. We integrate ourselves so thoroughly into the existing structure that removing us would cause more damage than benefit. Dr. Okafor nodded thoughtfully. It's a survival strategy that humans have perfected over thousands of years of evolution. We're not the strongest predators on our homeworld, so we learn to be the smartest. Lyrelay found herself fascinated, despite her initial skepticism. The Vulpine approach to problem solving was direct and overwhelming. Identify the obstacle, apply superior force, achieve victory through dominance. But watching the humans work was like observing a completely different species of intelligence. When the guards reduced food rations as punishment for a work slowdown in Sector 5, the humans didn't organize a protest or attempt sabotage. Instead, they quietly implemented a resource-sharing network that redistributed nutrition more efficiently across species lines. Prisoners who had been enemies began cooperating because the humans made cooperation more profitable than conflict. When a Gorvani named Brack was beaten nearly to death for questioning a guard's orders, the humans didn't seek revenge or retaliation. Dr. Okafor provided medical treatment that saved Brock's life, while Elena gathered intelligence about guard shift patterns and weak points in facility security. The information wasn't used for escape attempts or violence. It was filed away for future reference, part of an expanding database of knowledge that the humans were quietly building. "You're mapping the entire facility," Lyrella realized during her 6th week of collaboration. She was sitting in the storage room with Marcus and Sarah, reviewing a hand-drawn schematic of the prison complex that had been created through careful observation and measurement. Every guard rotation, every security protocol, every structural weakness. Among other things, Sarah confirmed. David's been working on the communication systems, both internal and external. We've identified 17 different ways to send messages beyond the facility perimeter without triggering the monitoring systems. Marcus pulled out another set of documents, personnel files compiled from careful observation and prisoner gossip. We know which guards are corrupt, which ones are just following orders, and which ones might be sympathetic to prisoner welfare. We know the warden's routine, the shift supervisor's preferences, even the maintenance schedule for the security systems. "But you're not planning an escape," Lyrally said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Escape to where?" Marcus asked reasonably. "Kethvar is 17 light-years from the nearest non-hegemony system. Even if we somehow acquired a ship, we'd be hunted down and executed as an example. No, running isn't the solution here." Elena leaned forward, her expression serious. "We're not planning an escape. We're planning a revolution." The word hung in the air between them like a live explosive. Revolution against the Vulpine hegemony was not just treason. It was a concept so alien to the established order that most species didn't even have terminology for it. The hegemony was eternal, inevitable, unstoppable. It had conquered half the galaxy through pure military superiority and showed no signs of weakness or decline. "That's insane," Lyrelai whispered. "The hegemony has millions of warships, billions of soldiers. They control trade routes, manufacturing centers, entire sectors of space. You're talking about a handful of prisoners on a remote moon, challenging an empire that spans thousands of worlds."
"Yes," Sarah said simply. "We are."
Okafor smiled, and there was something unsettling about the expression. "You're thinking about this in terms of conventional warfare. Direct confrontation, fleet actions, territorial conquest. That's how the Vulpines think, because that's how they've always won. But humans learned a long time ago that the strongest army doesn't always win the war." Over the following weeks, Lyreli began to understand what they meant. The humans weren't planning to fight the hegemony's military machine head-on. They were planning to make it collapse from within. It started with information warfare. David had managed to establish contact with human communities scattered throughout hegemony space, using the prison's own communication systems to create an encrypted network that the authorities couldn't detect. Every intercepted military dispatch, every guard conversation, every administrative memo was collected, analyzed, and distributed. "Knowledge is power," Elena explained. "The hegemony maintains control through information monopoly. They tell each species only what they need to know to remain compliant. But what happens when everyone knows everything?" The answer, Lyrale learned, was chaos. The humans had discovered that the hegemony was not nearly as stable as it appeared. Food shipments to conquered worlds were being deliberately reduced to maintain dependency. Rebellious populations were being quietly relocated to work camps disguised as voluntary resettlement programs. Military resources were being stretched thin by simultaneous conflicts in multiple sectors, hidden from the general population by carefully controlled media manipulation. But the most devastating revelation was the discovery of Project Culling, a systematic plan to reduce the populations of inferior species through orchestrated famines, disease outbreaks, and industrial accidents. The Vulpine leadership had decided that their empire was becoming too diverse to manage efficiently. The solution was to gradually eliminate species that didn't contribute sufficient military or economic value. "Humans are number 3 on the target list," Marcus informed her during one of their evening meetings, right after the Kalari philosophers and the trendy artists. Apparently, species that excel in non-essential skills are considered expendable. The information was devastating, but it was also weaponizable. The humans began sharing it with other prisoner groups, not as propaganda, but as verifiable intelligence that could be independently confirmed. The effect was immediate and profound. The Jektai discovered that their homeworld's mining quotas had been increased beyond sustainable levels, deliberately designed to exhaust the planet's resources within a generation. The Sithkar learned that their young were being systematically recruited for military service in ways that violated their species' most sacred cultural traditions. Even the Gorvani, who had been reliable hegemony allies for centuries, found evidence that their warrior culture was being manipulated through artificial hormone treatments designed to increase aggression and reduce independent thinking. "You're turning them all against each other," Lyrela observed.
"No,"
Dr. Okafor corrected gently. "We're revealing the truth about how they're already being turned against each other. The hegemony survives by keeping conquered species isolated, suspicious, competitive. When they realize they're all being manipulated by the same system, cooperation becomes inevitable. The transformation was remarkable to witness." Species that had been enemies for generations began working together out of pure necessity. Prison gangs that had operated along racial lines reorganized into resistance cells based on shared opposition to their captors. Guards who had relied on divide-and-conquer tactics found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by coordinated prisoner action. But the humans' true genius revealed itself in how they handled the inevitable crackdowns. When the prison administration attempted to restore order through increased violence and restrictions, the humans didn't respond with riots or protests. They responded with passive resistance that was impossible to counter effectively. Work slowdowns that couldn't be traced to any individual prisoner, equipment failures that seemed random but followed predictable patterns, communication breakdowns that appeared to be system malfunctions but were actually coordinated disruptions. The humans had studied the facility's operations so thoroughly that they could disrupt them without providing clear targets for retaliation. "It's like fighting smoke," Warden Korgath complained during a staff meeting that David had managed to intercept. "Every time I try to grab it, it slips through my fingers. Every time I think I've identified the problem, it appears somewhere else." Lyrelai found herself becoming an integral part of the operation in ways she had never expected. Her royal education had included extensive training in xenoarchaeology, stellar politics, and cultural analysis, skills that proved invaluable for understanding the complex relationships between different prisoner groups. Her natural empathy and diplomatic instincts made her an excellent liaison between the humans and other species who were suspicious of alien influence. But more than that, she discovered that her supposed weaknesses were actually strengths in this new context. Her inability to project psychic dominance made other species comfortable around her in ways they would never be with stronger Vulpines. Her small size and non-threatening appearance allowed her to gather information and build relationships without triggering defensive reactions. "You're becoming quite the revolutionary," Marcus observed one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports in their hidden meeting space. "Your family would be horrified." "Good," Lyrelai replied, and she was surprised by the venom in her own voice. "Let them be horrified. They threw me away because I didn't fit their definition of strength. Now I'm helping to build something that will make their definition irrelevant." It was during her 10th week of imprisonment that the first major breakthrough occurred. David had finally managed to establish two-way communication with resistance groups beyond Kethvar, creating a network that spanned multiple star systems. The messages they received painted a picture of an empire under more stress than anyone had realized: food riots on Volcara Prime, work stoppages in the Kithari manufacturing centers, open rebellion in the outer colonies, military defections among non-Vulpine officers who had learned the truth about Project Culling. The information warfare campaign that had started in a prison storage room was spreading across the galaxy like a virus. "We're not the only ones," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder as she read through the incoming reports. "There are human communities on 47 different worlds, all of them sharing intelligence and coordinating resistance activities. What we've accomplished here is being replicated everywhere." Dr. Okafor pulled up a galactic map that showed the scope of their network. Red dots marked confirmed resistance cells, yellow dots indicated potential allies, and green lines showed established communication links. The pattern that emerged was staggering. A web of connection and coordination that spanned the entire hegemony. "This is bigger than just resistance," Sarah breathed. "This is revolution on a scale that's never been attempted before." But Marcus looked troubled as he studied the data. "It's also more dangerous than anything we've done so far. The hegemony isn't going to tolerate this level of organized opposition. They're going to respond with everything they have. As if summoned by his words, alarms began shrieking throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in pulsing red as automated systems announced an incoming priority transmission from Hegemony Command. Through the chaos, they could hear Warden Korgath's voice over the intercom, barely controlled rage making his words nearly incomprehensible. All prisoners return to cells immediately. Lockdown protocols are now in effect. Any prisoner found outside designated areas will be executed on site. Elena was already gathering their documents and equipment, preparing to scatter and hide the evidence of their activities. But Lyrelay found herself frozen, staring at the communication device that was still receiving updates from their network. The messages were becoming increasingly desperate, filled with reports of hegemony military forces moving towards suspected resistance strongholds. "They know," she whispered. "Somehow, they've figured out what we're doing." Marcus checked the security monitor David had installed to watch the corridor approaches. Armed guards were moving through the facility in full combat gear, conducting cell-by-cell searches with lethal efficiency. Their usual routine inspections had been replaced by systematic raids designed to uncover hidden contraband and communication equipment. "We need to get you out of here," he said urgently. "If they find a Vulpine princess in the middle of this operation, they'll execute all of us as traitors." But Lyrelai shook her head, a strange calm settling over her as she realized what needed to happen. "No. If they're going to break up our network, we need to make sure the information survives. Someone has to carry the intelligence to other resistance cells, and someone has to ensure that what we've learned here gets transmitted to every human community in the galaxy." She moved to the communication array and began uploading everything they had gathered: facility schematics, guard rotations, intelligence reports, contact information for other resistance groups. The data stream would take several minutes to complete, time they didn't have. "Lyrelai, don't be stupid," Sarah hissed. "This isn't a heroic sacrifice scenario." "We can find another way." "No," Lyrelai replied firmly, her hands steady on the controls despite the chaos erupting around them. "This is exactly what my people never understood about me. I'm not weak because I can't dominate others. I'm strong because I choose to serve something bigger than myself." The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer. In moments, the guards would reach their hidden meeting place and discover everything. But the data upload was complete, and the information that could change the course of the war was already spreading through their network. Princess Lyrelai of the Vulpine hegemony stood up and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. Behind her, the humans melted into the shadows like smoke, carrying with them the seeds of revolution that would soon bloom across the galaxy. For the first time in her life, she understood what real strength felt like. The interrogation chamber was designed to break minds as efficiently as bodies. Psychic dampeners hummed in the walls, creating a nauseating interference that made it impossible for Vulpine prisoners to access their mental abilities. The temperature fluctuated between freezing and sweltering without warning, while sonic disruptors emitted frequencies carefully calibrated to cause maximum discomfort across multiple species. But what made the room truly terrifying was its complete isolation from hope. Lyrelai had been strapped to the interrogation chair for 6 hours before Commander Vashik finally entered. Her brother's former military advisor moved with a predatory grace that marked all high-ranking Vulpine officers, his massive frame radiating psychic dominance even through the dampening field. His amber eyes held no warmth, no recognition of their shared species, only the cold calculation of someone deciding how best to extract information from a traitor. "Princess Lyrelai Kethveros Thalin," he said formally, using her full royal designation with deliberate mockery. "Daughter of Emperor Thokrin, sister to Crown Prince Kareth, exile and prisoner of the hegemony. You stand accused of treason, conspiracy to commit rebellion, and collaboration with enemy combatants." "I wasn't aware that seeking fair treatment for prisoners constituted collaboration with enemies," Lyrelai replied, her voice hoarse from hours of thirst but steady with conviction. Vashik smiled, an expression that revealed far too many teeth. "Fair treatment? Yes, that's what you call it. Our intelligence suggests otherwise." He activated a holographic display that showed detailed schematics of the prison facility, the same ones that David and the humans had so carefully compiled. "These plans were found in your possession. They show guard rotations, security vulnerabilities, communication systems, and structural weaknesses." "This is not the work of someone seeking fair treatment. This is the work of someone planning escape or insurrection." The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Lyrelai knew that her response would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the safety of every human in the facility. If Vashek believed that the resistance network was centered on her, he might focus his investigation on traditional Vulpine methods: dominance, hierarchy, top-down command structure. He might miss the real nature of what the humans had built. "You're right," she said simply. Vashek's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features before the professional mask reasserted itself. "Explain." "I was planning escape," Lyreley continued, allowing exhaustion and defeat to color her voice. "I couldn't accept my exile, couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of my life in this place. So I gathered intelligence, hoping to find a way out." She gestured weakly at the schematics. "As you can see, I'm not very good at it." "And your collaboration with the humans?" "What collaboration?" Lyreley forced confusion into her expression. "You mean the work teams?" "We're all assigned to the same mining details. I spoke with them because they were the only ones who weren't actively hostile to a disgraced royal." She let bitterness creep into her voice, drawing on genuine feelings of isolation and abandonment. "They showed me how to modify equipment to make the work easier. Basic mechanical principles, nothing more sophisticated than lever systems and pulley arrangements." It wasn't entirely a lie. The humans had helped her with the work, had shown her engineering solutions to physical problems, but it was such a small fragment of the truth that it felt like a betrayal of everything they had accomplished together. Vashek studied her for a long moment, his enhanced senses analyzing micro-expressions and physiological responses for signs of deception. The psychic dampeners made it impossible for him to simply tear the truth from her mind, but his training in conventional interrogation was extensive. "You expect me to believe that a member of the royal family resorted to collaboration with primitive aliens out of desperation? I expect you to believe that a member of the royal family who was exiled for weakness might make poor decisions when faced with impossible circumstances?" Lyreley replied. "My siblings were right about me, Commander. I don't have the strength to endure hardship with dignity. I panicked, I sought help wherever I could find it, and I made plans that were doomed from the start." The self-deprecation was bitter in her mouth, but it served its purpose. Vashek's posture relaxed slightly as the narrative aligned with his expectations. A weak princess making foolish choices out of desperation was a story that made sense within his worldview. It was easier to believe than the reality that the weakest member of the royal family had helped orchestrate a resistance network spanning multiple star systems. "The humans," Vashek pressed. "What do you know about their activities?" "They work hard, they don't cause trouble, and they die quietly when the conditions become too harsh for them," Lyreley said with what she hoped sounded like callous indifference. "They're not warriors or leaders. They're just trying to survive, same as everyone else here." Another fragment of truth wrapped around a core of misdirection. The humans were indeed focused on survival, but their definition of survival included the complete overthrow of the system that oppressed them. Their quiet deaths were often elaborate theater designed to remove individuals from official records while relocating them to hidden positions within the facility. Vashek consulted his datapad, scrolling through reports that Lyreley couldn't see but desperately wanted to understand. "Our investigation has revealed significant irregularities in prison operations over the past few months. Work efficiency improvements, reduction in conflict between prisoner groups, unauthorized modifications to facility systems. These changes coincide exactly with your arrival." "Correlation isn't causation," Lyreley replied, drawing on statistical principles her tutors had drilled into her years ago. "My arrival also coincided with the seasonal atmospheric changes that reduced the frequency of dust storms. Are you going to credit me with weather control as well?" "Don't be clever with me, Princess." The title was a curse in Vashek's mouth. "Cleverness is what got you into this situation in the first place. Your family warned me that you had a tendency toward intellectual arrogance. The personal attack stung more than physical torture would have, partly because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Lyreley had always prided herself on her intelligence, using academic achievement to compensate for her physical inadequacies. But she had also learned something in this place that her royal education had never taught her. Sometimes wisdom meant knowing when to appear foolish. "Then perhaps you should listen to my family's assessment," she said quietly. "I'm not a master strategist or revolutionary leader. I'm just a failed princess who made some poor choices out of desperation and loneliness." Vashek stood and paced around the chair, his massive presence designed to intimidate through physical dominance. "The humans are planning something. Our intelligence indicates coordinated activities across multiple facilities, communications that shouldn't exist, organizational structures that suggest military training. You're going to tell me what you know about their network." This was the crucial moment. Lyreley could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her like the gravity of a collapsing star. Everything she said now would determine whether the Resistance survived or whether thousands of beings across the galaxy would pay the price for her choices. "What network?" she asked, and let genuine puzzlement color her voice. "Commander, I think you're overestimating both human capabilities and my own influence. They're not soldiers or strategists. They're farmers, engineers, craftspeople, civilians who were in the wrong place when your forces decided to make an example of them. Civilians don't establish galactic communication networks or coordinate resistance activities across 17 star systems," Vashek snapped. "Then maybe you're looking for the wrong people," Liralai suggested. "If there's really a network operating on that scale, it would require resources, training, and leadership that no human community could possibly possess. You should be investigating other species, ones with actual military experience and technological capabilities." It was a dangerous gambit. By deflecting suspicion away from the humans, she was potentially directing it toward other prisoner populations who were innocent of the specific charges but might be brutalized in the investigation. But it was also strategically sound. Vashek's preconceptions about human weakness made him unlikely to credit them with sophisticated operations. The interrogation continued for hours, with Vashek probing for inconsistencies in her story while Liralai maintained the fiction of a desperate, foolish princess who had stumbled into minor collaboration through personal weakness rather than ideological conviction. It was exhausting work, requiring her to suppress every instinct toward pride and defiance in favor of apparent submission. But as the hours passed, she began to realize that she was winning. Vashek's questions became more routine, his attention drifted to other concerns, and his body language suggested frustration with an investigation that wasn't yielding the results he expected. Her story was holding together because it aligned with everything the hegemony believed about both human limitations. When the session finally ended, Liralai was returned to solitary confinement rather than her regular cell punishment for her escape planning but not the execution that would have followed a treason conviction. The isolation was harsh, but it was also a form of protection. As long as the authorities believed she was just a failed escape artist rather than a resistance coordinator, they would focus their investigation in the wrong direction. Her cell in solitary was even smaller than her previous accommodation, with no window and barely enough room to lie down. The walls were bare metal, designed to prevent any form of comfort or stimulation that might help prisoners maintain their sanity during extended isolation. But Liralai found that her mind was clearer than it had been since her arrest. The interrogation had taught her something important about herself and about the nature of strength. For her entire life, she had been told that her value came from her ability to dominate others, to project force and command obedience. Her failure to meet those standards had been treated as a fundamental character flaw that made her unworthy of respect or love. But working with the humans had shown her a different model of strength, one based on service rather than dominance, on building others up rather than tearing them down, on finding solutions that benefited everyone rather than establishing hierarchies that benefited only the strong. It was a form of power that the Vulpine mindset literally could not comprehend. During her third week in solitary, a guard slipped her a piece of paper hidden inside her food ration. The message was brief, coded in a simple substitution cipher that David had taught her weeks ago. Network intact. Operations expanded. Your sacrifice remembered. The note was unsigned, but she recognized Marcus's careful handwriting in the way certain letters were formed. The Resistance had survived her capture, had learned from the security breach, and was continuing to grow. More importantly, they remembered that she had chosen to protect them rather than herself. That night, lying in the darkness of her cell and listening to the distant sounds of the facility's operation, Liralai made a decision that would have horrified her former self. She was not going to escape from this place. She was not going to return to her family or seek redemption in their eyes. So, she was going to stay exactly where she was and continue the work that the humans had started. Because she had finally understood something fundamental about herself and about the nature of true strength. She was not weak because she couldn't dominate others. She was strong because she could inspire them to become something greater than they had ever imagined possible. The Vulpine hegemony had exiled her as a failed princess, but she was returning as something far more dangerous. A revolutionary who understood that real power came not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to create something better. When the guards came to return her to general population after her month in solitary, they found her different than they expected. Not broken by the isolation, not desperate for human contact, not begging for mercy or leniency. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made them uncomfortable, a sense of purpose that suggested she had found something in the darkness that they couldn't understand. The human network welcomed her back with subtle signs of respect and affection, a modified work assignment that played to her analytical strengths. access to intelligence briefings that showed how far their operations had expanded, inclusion in planning sessions for operations that would soon span multiple sectors of the galaxy. But it was Marcus who best understood what had changed during her time in solitary. "You're not the same person who was arrested a month ago," he observed during one of their carefully concealed meetings. "No," Lyrale agreed, looking at her hands, small, delicate, unsuited for physical violence, but perfectly adapted for the precise work of building something new from the ruins of something broken. "I'm not. The princess who came to this place was looking for a way out. The person I am now is looking for a way through." She looked around at the faces gathered in their hidden meeting space. Humans and aliens, former enemies, united by shared purpose, individuals who had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in what they could destroy, but in what they could create together. "The hegemony thinks they broke me with exile and interrogation," she continued. "But what they actually did was show me who I really am. Not a failed princess, but a successful revolutionary. And that's something they're going to regret teaching me. In the depths of a prison moon designed to crush hope and break spirits, the exiled princess had found her true strength. And across the galaxy, a network of resistance cells was preparing to show the Vulpine hegemony exactly what that strength could accomplish when properly focused. The revolution was no longer coming. It had already begun. 6 months after her return from solitary confinement, Lyrale stood in the main assembly hall of Kefvar prison and watched the Vulpine hegemony begin to tear itself apart. The transformation had been gradual, almost invisible to the guards and administrators who thought they understood how their facility operated. What they saw was improved prisoner compliance, reduced violence between species groups, and more efficient work output, exactly the kind of changes that suggested their authority was being respected rather than undermined. What they didn't see was the careful orchestration behind those improvements, the subtle networks that had turned their prison into the nerve center of a galactic revolution. The assembly hall had been built to accommodate the entire prisoner population for mandatory propaganda broadcasts, its stark walls designed to amplify the psychological impact of hegemony messaging. But today's broadcast was different. Instead of the usual imperial propaganda, the screen showed live feeds from 17 different star systems, each one documenting the collapse of hegemony authority in real time. On Calthera Prime, the industrial shipyards that built the Empire's vast fleet had gone silent as workers simply stopped reporting for their shifts. On Vexo Station, the strategic command center that coordinated military operations across 3 sectors had been evacuated after a system malfunction that left every computer displaying the same message: truth is the enemy of tyranny. Tyranny is the enemy of peace. Most shocking of all was the feed from Volcara itself, the hegemony homeworld that no enemy force had ever approached. The capital city was burning as massive crowds gathered in the streets, demanding answers about Project Cullen and the systematic deception that had hidden the Empire's true nature from its own citizens. "Remarkable," Dr. Okafor murmured, standing beside Lyrale as they watched the screens. "I don't think anyone expected it to spread this quickly." "The humans did," Lyrale replied, remembering conversations from months ago when Marcus and his team had discussed the potential for cascade failure in authoritarian systems. "You understood that empires built on deception become vulnerable once the truth starts spreading faster than they can suppress it. Around them, the other prisoners watched in stunned silence as the foundations of their reality crumbled in real time. Guards who should have been maintaining order stood transfixed by images of their supposedly invincible empire, revealing itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The revolution hadn't come through military conquest or violent uprising. It had spread like a virus through the hegemony's own communication networks, using the Empire's infrastructure against itself. Every intercepted message, every decoded transmission, every carefully documented piece of evidence had been compiled into an irrefutable case against the system that ruled their lives. But what made the evidence devastating wasn't just its accuracy, it was its accessibility. The humans had learned something crucial about information warfare that the traditional resistance movements had missed. The truth only had power when people could understand it, verify it, and share it with others. Sarah Chen had pioneered the techniques they called truth engineering, taking complex intelligence and transforming it into simple, verifiable claims that ordinary citizens could investigate for themselves. Instead of demanding that people accept shocking revelations on faith, the resistance provided tools and methods that allowed individuals to discover the truth through their own research. The result was an informed population that the hegemony couldn't dismiss as ignorant or misled. When factory workers on industrial worlds began calculating resource flows and realized they were being systematically starved to maintain artificial scarcity, They didn't need outside agitators to tell them they were being oppressed. When military officers discovered that casualty reports were being falsified to hide the true cost of expansion campaigns, they didn't need propaganda to convince them that their leadership was corrupt. The beauty of it, Elena explained during one of their strategy sessions, is that we're not asking people to believe us. We're asking them to believe their own eyes and their own calculations. David had been instrumental in ensuring that the evidence reached the right audiences through channels that couldn't be easily monitored or disrupted. The hegemony's communication networks were designed to carry official messages quickly and efficiently across vast distances, but they had never been secured against the possibility that those same channels might be used by their enemies. Every authoritarian system has the same vulnerability, he had told Lyra months earlier. They need communication networks to maintain control, but those same networks can be turned against them by people who understand how they really work. Now, watching the results of that strategy play out across the galaxy, Lyra marveled at the elegance of what the humans had accomplished. They hadn't destroyed the hegemony through superior force or advanced technology. They had simply revealed what it really was beneath the propaganda and intimidation that held it together. The morning assembly was interrupted when Warden Korgath appeared on the main platform, his usually immaculate uniform disheveled and his psychic presence radiating barely controlled panic. The screens that had been showing the galactic upheaval went dark as he activated the facility's internal communication system. "Attention all prisoners!" His voice echoed through the hall with forced authority. "Recent transmissions showing alleged civil unrest in hegemony space are enemy propaganda designed to create false hope and encourage illegal activities. Any prisoner found discussing or spreading these fabrications will be subject to immediate disciplinary action." The announcement was met with absolute silence from the assembled prisoners, but Lyra could feel the shift in the hall's atmosphere. Korgath's denial of what they had all just witnessed was so transparently desperate that it undermined his credibility more effectively than any counter-argument could have. Marcus caught her eye from across the hall and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The final phase of their operation was about to begin. Over the past month, they had been preparing for this moment, the point when the external revolution reached sufficient momentum that direct action within the prison itself became both possible and necessary. The guards were demoralized, the administration was paralyzed by conflicting orders from higher authorities who were dealing with their own crises, and the prisoner population was unified in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. But the humans had taught Lyra that timing was everything in revolutionary action. Move too early and the authorities could suppress the uprising before it gained momentum. Move too late, and the opportunity might be lost to circumstances beyond their control. The signal came during the afternoon work shift, when David's carefully monitored communication intercepts revealed that Hegemony Command was preparing to implement final solution protocols at all prison facilities. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality. They were planning to eliminate the entire prisoner population rather than risk losing control of facilities that had become centers of resistance coordination. "They're panicking," Marcus explained during an emergency leadership meeting held in the mining tunnels. "The revolution has spread faster than they anticipated, and they're resorting to mass murder to contain the damage." Elena consulted the tactical plans they had been refining for months. The transport ships will arrive within 6 hours to begin prisoner evacuations, which means execution. "We have to move now or we lose our chance entirely." But Lyra was thinking about more than just the immediate tactical situation. It's not enough to escape, or even to take control of the facility. We need to make this part of the larger strategic picture. Okafor nodded, understanding. "You're thinking about the symbolic value. A successful prison uprising, broadcast across the galaxy at the same time as the external revolution, becomes proof that the hegemony can be defeated, even in their most secure facilities." "Exactly. But more than that, we need to demonstrate the principles that the revolution is fighting for. If we take this place through violence and domination, we're just replacing one form of tyranny with another." It was Sarah who suggested the solution that would become legendary in the histories written years later. "We don't take the prison. We transform it." The operation began at sunset, when the guard shift change created a brief window of reduced surveillance. But instead of using that opportunity for escape attempts or attacks on personnel, the prisoners implemented what Marcus would later call constructive revolution, the systematic replacement of an oppressive system with something better. Working in coordinated teams that had been planning this moment for months, they began retrofitting the facility's infrastructure. Mining equipment was converted to manufacturing tools that could produce everything from communication devices to medical supplies. The water purification system was expanded to support not just survival but genuine health and comfort. Living spaces were reconfigured to provide privacy and dignity rather than just containment. Most importantly, they established new governance structures based on the consensus-building principles that the humans had demonstrated. Instead of guard-prisoner hierarchies, they created working groups organized around shared goals and collaborative problem-solving. The transformation was so complete and so rapidly implemented that the remaining guards found themselves not so much defeated as simply irrelevant. Their weapons and authority meant nothing in a system that no longer recognized violence as a legitimate source of power. When Warden Korgath attempted to reassert control by threatening to call in military reinforcements, he discovered that the communication systems were no longer under his authority. David had quietly transferred control to the prisoner committees, who used the facility's own transmitters to broadcast their declaration of independence across the galaxy. To all beings suffering under the tyranny of the Vulpine hegemony, Lyrelai spoke into the transmission array that had once carried orders for their oppression. "We are the prisoners of Kethvar, representing dozens of species from across known space. Today we declare ourselves free, not through conquest but through cooperation, not through violence but through the courage to build something better than what we found." The words were carried by the same communication networks that had previously spread news of the Galactic Uprising, but they represented something new, a positive vision of what could replace the system that was crumbling around them. "We do not seek revenge against our former captors," she continued. "We seek justice for all beings who have suffered under systems that treat individuals as expendable resources. We do not claim dominion over this facility through right of conquest. We claim stewardship through commitment to the principles of dignity, cooperation, and mutual aid that make civilization possible." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages began flooding in from resistance cells across the galaxy, from hegemony citizens who were discovering the truth about their government, even from military units that were refusing orders to suppress civilian populations. But the most significant response came from the hegemony capital itself, where Crown Prince Kareth appeared on emergency broadcasts to announce martial law and the suspension of civil liberties across all hegemony space. "The terrorists and traitors who have infiltrated our communication networks will be found and eliminated," he declared, his massive frame radiating the kind of psychic dominance that had always been the hegemony's ultimate argument against resistance. "Order will be restored, and those who have betrayed the Empire will face the consequences of their treachery." Lyrelai watched her brother's image on the screen and felt nothing but pity for him. He was still thinking in terms of force and intimidation, still believing that fear was stronger than hope, still trapped in a worldview that could only understand strength as the ability to destroy rather than the courage to create. "He doesn't understand what's happening," Marcus observed quietly. "He thinks this is just another rebellion that can be crushed through superior firepower." "No," Lyrelai replied, her voice filled with the certainty that came from months of working alongside beings who had redefined her understanding of what strength really meant. "He understands exactly what's happening. That's why he's so afraid." Around them, the former prison continued its transformation into something unprecedented in galactic history, a community built on principles of cooperation rather than domination, where different species worked together not because they were forced to, but because they had discovered that collaboration made them all stronger. It was, Lyrelai realized, everything she had ever dreamed of but had never been able to articulate during her years as a royal princess, a place where strength was measured not by the ability to impose one's will on others, but by the wisdom to help others discover their own potential for greatness. The exiled princess had found her true strength, and in doing so she had helped kindle a revolution that would reshape the galaxy itself. 2 years after the fall of the Vulpine hegemony, Lyrelai stood in the ruins of the Imperial Palace and tried to remember what it had felt like to call this place home. The throne room, where she had once been pronounced weak and sentenced to exile, was now a council chamber where representatives from 47 species gathered to debate the future of their shared civilization. The symbols of imperial power had been carefully preserved but recontextualized, not destroyed in revolutionary fury, but transformed into reminders of what happened when strength was defined solely as the ability to dominate others. The palace itself had become a museum and educational center, its opulent chambers converted into libraries, research facilities, and meeting spaces for the cooperative networks that had emerged from the wreckage of the Empire. But what struck Lyrelai most profoundly was how alive the place felt now, filled with voices and ideas and collaborative energy that had never existed during the centuries of Imperial rule. "Strange to be back?" Marcus asked, joining her on the observation balcony that overlooked the main council floor. He looked older than his years, bearing the weight of leadership that had fallen on him as one of the primary architects of the revolution. But there was a contentment in his expression that spoke of work well done and principles maintained even in victory. "Everything's strange now," Lyrelai replied, watching as a Jektai engineer demonstrated a new terraforming technique to a mixed group of human agriculturalists and Sithkar environmental specialists. The universe I grew up in doesn't exist anymore. Sometimes I'm not sure the person I used to be ever existed either. The transformation had been more complete than anyone had anticipated. What began as a prison uprising had cascaded into the peaceful dissolution of the largest empire in galactic history, replaced not by conquest from without, but by evolution from within. The revolution had succeeded because it offered people something better than what they had lost, rather than simply destroying what they had feared. Marcus nodded toward the council floor, where her brother Kareth sat among the Vulpine delegation. His once imposing frame diminished by more than just the absence of royal regalia. He's been asking about you again. Lyrelai had avoided direct contact with her family since the transition began, focusing instead on the massive logistical challenges of rebuilding galactic civilization around cooperative rather than hierarchical principles, but she knew that confrontation was inevitable. The old world and the new world could not coexist indefinitely without addressing the trauma that had birthed the change. What does he want? Same thing he's wanted for months, Marcus replied. To understand how his weak little sister became the most influential person in the galaxy. It was an exaggeration, but not by much. The principles that Lyrelai had helped develop during their time in prison had become the foundation for the new order. Consensus building over dominance, cooperation over competition, problem solving over problem creating. Her name appeared on founding documents and philosophical treatises that were reshaping how entire species understood the nature of strength and civilization. But she had also learned enough about human psychology to understand that titles and recognition were less important than the work itself. The revolution had succeeded because it focused on building better systems rather than celebrating individual heroes. I'll talk to him, she decided. But not here, and not as part of some formal reconciliation ceremony. This needs to be personal. She found Kareth that evening in the palace garden, sitting alone beneath the luminescent trees that had once provided private contemplation space for the imperial family. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck by how much he had aged in the 2 years since the Empire's collapse. The psychic dominance that had once been his defining characteristic had faded to a barely perceptible whisper, leaving behind something more recognizably vulnerable. "Hello, Kareth." "Hello, sister." The word carried no warmth, but also none of the contempt that had marked their last conversation. "You look well. Leadership suits you better than Exiled did." Lyrelai settled onto the bench across from him, maintaining enough distance to avoid triggering defensive instincts while close enough for genuine conversation. "I'm not sure leadership is the right word. I help coordinate collaborative efforts between different working groups. It's more like facilitation than command." "Don't minimize what you've accomplished," Kareth said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice despite the obvious struggle it caused him. "You've redefined how power works in this galaxy. That's not facilitation, that's fundamental transformation of reality itself." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the gardens around them and the distant voices from the council chambers where people were still working late into the evening to address the complex challenges of post-imperial reconstruction. "I owe you an apology," Kareth said finally. "Multiple apologies, actually, but I'm not sure I have the words for all of them." "You don't need to apologize for following the system you were raised in," Lyrelai replied carefully. "We were all products of that system. The difference is that some of us found ways to grow beyond it. No, it's more than that." Kareth turned to face her directly, his amber eyes holding a pain that she recognized from her own years of exile and self-doubt. "I convinced myself that strength meant the ability to impose my will on others, and I used that definition to justify treating you as expendable. But what you've built here, this whole cooperative civilization, requires a kind of strength I never understood and couldn't develop." He gestured toward the palace complex where lights burned and windows that housed working groups focused on everything from interspecies medicine to stellar engineering to conflict resolution. "You've created something that makes people stronger rather than forcing them to submit. That's not just different from what we had before. It's the opposite of what we had before." Lyrelai felt the familiar weight of old hurt, but also something new. A recognition that her brother was genuinely struggling to understand concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of power and authority. "It wasn't just me," she said. "The humans taught me that real strength comes from helping others discover their own potential. Everything we've built here is based on principles that their species developed over thousands of years, of learning to survive through cooperation rather than domination." "The humans," Kareth repeated, and his tone held a wonder that would have been impossible during the days of the Empire. We dismissed them as primitives because they didn't have our technology or our psychic abilities. But they understood something about civilization that we never learned in all our centuries of conquest. They understood that diversity makes systems stronger rather than weaker, Lirelai confirmed. That different perspectives lead to better solutions than uniform thinking. That collaboration creates more value than competition. Kareth was quiet for a long moment, absorbing concepts that were fundamentally alien to his lifelong training. During the trial when we exiled you, I believed I was protecting the Empire from weakness. I thought your inability to dominate others made you a threat to our way of life. You were right, Lirelai said quietly. I was a threat to your way of life, but not because I was weak, because I represented a different definition of strength that made your definition obsolete. And now the Empire is gone, replaced by something that would have been impossible under our old understanding of how power works. Kareth shook his head in what might have been amazement or regret. The irony is that you've accomplished something none of our greatest military leaders ever managed. You've unified the galaxy. We've created the foundation for unification, Lirelai corrected. The actual work of building a truly cooperative galactic civilization is going to take generations, maybe centuries. But even as she spoke, she could see evidence of that work progressing all around them. The gardens themselves had been redesigned using principles from dozens of different botanical traditions, creating something more beautiful and sustainable than any single species could have achieved alone. The administrative buildings housed research projects that combined technologies and methodologies from across known space, producing innovations that were advancing faster than anything the Empire had ever accomplished through its more rigid hierarchical approach. I have another confession to make, Kareth said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I've been studying human philosophy and organizational theory for the past year, trying to understand how they think about leadership and social structure. Lirelai raised an eyebrow. And I've been wondering if there's a place for someone like me in this new world, someone who spent decades enforcing a system based on dominance and hierarchy, but who wants to learn how to contribute to something based on cooperation and consensus. It was a question that went to the heart of one of the greatest challenges facing post-imperial civilization. How do you integrate people who are shaped by oppressive systems without either perpetuating that oppression or excluding them from the possibility of redemption? There's a place for everyone who's willing to do the work of learning and growing, Lirelai said carefully, but it requires genuine commitment to changing not just your behavior but your fundamental understanding of how relationships and power should work. Even for former tyrants? Especially for former tyrants. The perspective you bring, understanding how oppressive systems operate from the inside, could be invaluable for designing safeguards that prevent future tyranny, but only if you're truly committed to serving the common good rather than seeking personal redemption. Kareth nodded slowly, and Lirelai could see him processing the implications of what she was saying. The New Order didn't offer easy forgiveness or simple answers, but it did offer the possibility of transformation for those willing to embrace it genuinely. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me learn how to be useful in this new world instead of just nostalgic for the old one?" It was, Lirelai realized, the question she had been waiting for without knowing it. Not an apology for past wrongs, not an acknowledgement of her success, but a request for partnership in building something better than either of them could create alone. "Yes," she said, "but not as your sister teaching her brother, and not as a leader instructing a follower. As colleagues working together towards shared goals." They shook hands, a human gesture that had become common throughout the post-imperial civilization as a symbol of partnership rather than dominance, and in that moment Lirelai felt the last threads of her old identity finally dissolve completely. She was no longer the exiled princess who had been deemed too weak to deserve her heritage. She was no longer the revolutionary who had helped overthrow the system that oppressed her. She was something entirely new, a person who had learned that true strength came not from what you could take or destroy, but from what you could give and create. The galaxy around them was full of beings discovering the same truth, learning to define themselves not by what they could dominate, but by what they could contribute. It was a transformation that would echo across the stars for generations, reshaping not just governments and institutions, but the fundamental understanding of what it meant to be strong in a universe where cooperation was proving more powerful than conquest. As they walked back toward the palace complex together, Lirelai looked up at the stars that had once seemed like markers of imperial territory and saw instead infinite possibilities for exploration, discovery, and growth. The universe was vast enough for every species to find their own path while still working together toward shared dreams of peace, prosperity, and understanding. The weak had indeed inherited the stars, but only by redefining weakness as the courage to build rather than the failure to destroy. And in that redefinition, they had discovered a strength that no empire could defeat, because it grew stronger through every act of cooperation, every gesture of kindness, every choice to create rather than consume. The revolution was complete, but the real work, the work of building a civilization worthy of the universe's infinite potential, was just beginning. And for the first time since her exile from the imperial court, Lyreley looked forward to the future with unqualified hope.